Since 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act has explicitly prohibited disability-based discrimination, but the abstract reality of employee protection clauses belie the day-to-day work experience in which a dominant work culture may implicitly signal, if not explicitly encourage, conformity. That was an excerpt from a June 3rd, 2019 article from the Harvard Business Review entitled Why People Hide Their Disability at Work. And I think the article keys in on the biggest threat to disability inclusion in the workplace, which is the enormous power disparities that exist specifically between the disabled employee and their employer. Now, just because this dynamic is around doesn't mean that discrimination is going to happen, but it certainly opens the door. And oftentimes, when this happens, issues that come up aren't overt, and there's always kind of the internal dialogue that runs in the disabled employee's head. Whether an issue rises to the level where they want to risk possibly their relationships with their friends or colleagues at work and the way they may view them. It's also about timing. Is this something that you're going to get a resolution anytime quick? And even if you do, ultimately, what is as a disabled employee, what's your end result? I mean, you may have received a resolution around a specific issue, but by then so much attention's drawn, so much time's gone by, you may think that now your employer views you differently. Now you're a challenging employee. Maybe you're not a team member. Maybe you don't fit into the culture. Maybe it's going to possibly affect your evaluation. As you go on, you're trying to navigate your career, and maybe that's going to affect promotions in the future. So all these things run internally, run through the disabled employee's head. And also, issues don't always have to be legally, kind of within these confines of what's legally considered discrimination. And in fact, you always hear the mantra of know your rights. Well, as a disabled employee, that you can certainly understand the general four corners of what the ADA entails and what your rights are as a disabled employee, but it's much more nuanced than that. There's so much to it. It really does require, when you get into it, an expert understanding of the law, and also just your ability to kind of take this on. And so we want to walk through with an expert, Ben Jackson, who is an attorney with Disability Rights of Maryland, ways in which we can practically, quickly resolve and really create a better working environment where you don't feel isolated. You don't feel like you against the company when issues come up. And in fact, you can better prepare for the future. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for those of you who are joining us. It's great to be talking today with Ben Jackson. Ben Jackson is with the Disability Rights of Maryland, and I'm going to kind of let you describe a little bit about the work you do there and about the organization itself, if you could.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Noah. And, I appreciate the invitation to come talk to you all today about Disability Rights Maryland, employment, and a little bit about what the organization does. So Disability Rights Maryland is a protection and advocacy organization. There's one protection and advocacy organization in all 50 states and territories. It's a federally designated program, and then there's a number of different federal grants. And so under those grants, we were tasked with different subject matter areas. So I work under two federal grants. One is the protection and advocacy for voting rights. And so ensuring that individuals with disabilities have access to the electoral process, from registering to vote through casting the ballot, to ensure that the process is accessible for everyone, that voters with disabilities can mark, cast, and verify their ballots privately and independently. And then I also am funded under the protection and advocacy of beneficiaries of Social Security, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so under that work, what I'm tasked with doing is reducing barriers to employment for individuals with disabilities who are receiving Social Security on the basis of disability. And so really trying to make sure that people can advance, gain, and maintain employment.
Yeah, and I just to provide a little bit more background. So we've had discussions. I reached out to you, and initially, I reached out and I have heard that description of you work with primarily those with Social Security benefits and the protections around that. I wasn't sure if it aligned exactly with what I was doing, with what my mission was, but in talking with you, it actually does. I mean, we'll get into that. There are
Right.
some great overlays in terms of kind of my work, what I'm trying to do, and which is with dyslexia on the job. It's really focused on, I started it really around those who are similar to me, those who have dyslexia, those who've come out of college, got into the workforce. And it wasn't necessarily those first steps in getting the early jobs. It was, and for those of us who've kind of gone through school and education, gotten our higher degrees, we've essentially learned what our skills are, where our weaknesses are, and ways to manage it
Sure.
ourselves from there.
So I just wanted to piggyback a little bit about what Noah said of kind of learning yourself through the educational system, and then once you graduated, and learning your strengths and weaknesses in the employment context. And so, in not so many words, what Noah's describing is, figuring out what accommodations work for him. So, or, and that's through the academic process as well as the employment process. And so what's really important for all workers and workers with disabilities is just to figure out what works best for you, and then be able to advocate for that in the workspace. And in previous conversation that I had with Noah, we were discussing how different Fortune 500 companies and all these other major employers have started to focus on hiring workers with disabilities, and they're doing it in a thoughtful and I think in a well-intentioned manner. And they've conducted some studies, and they found that workers with disabilities outperform workers without disabilities in a number of key metrics, and they're looking to really capitalize on this kind of underutilized source of talent. But those employers that are not specifically focused on that, but are still hiring individuals with disabilities, there's sometimes going to be a little bit of growing pains for the employer and employee. And it really comes, and I think a lot of it stems from the power disparities that exist between employers and disabled employees or job seekers. If it's not a super large company that doesn't have a robust HR department, they might not be aware that the ADA triggers during the job application process. So if you need accommodations to that process, those accommodations are available to job seekers.
Yeah, and I'll just add too. I think the way you kind of laid it out too, with the focus being there's a lot of focus, and it's really led by these Fortune 500 companies. But what I wanted to touch on is some of the power disparities that were around when I was, kind of first coming out of college, going into the workforce, and what I've experienced are still there in some ways. Years ago, it was widely understood within the dyslexic community to never disclose your disability during the hiring process. And the thinking was that it would be much easier to work out any accommodation issues once you had the job than to run the risk of possibly running into a hiring manager with biases or the stigmas that are associated with disability and not actually getting the job first. That said, there is, I think, much better focus around inclusion now, and as a result, employers are starting to try to address this issue by holding specific initiative hiring events specific to the neurodiverse community, and that is, that it makes it much easier. And there are a number of studies that show employees that are able to disclose upfront are much happier in their work. But as we'll talk with Ben, there's evidence out there that does show that there is still some stigmas and biases that some employers still hold around disability. So we still have some work to do.
With that, I think what I'd like to do is kind of go into the example that I experienced or talked about with others, and that was this issue over disclosing. And I know it is a major focus, and it is important. If you can disclose, do it off the bat. There, as we said, there's such a need for companies to understand and to work with you within the kind of the framework of the ADA. And,
Right.
And again, this was something I was taught. It was like, you don't disclose until after you're given the offer, you're made the offer, in one of the positions I had, I was made an offer, accept the offer. And as soon as I accepted the offer, I had a license of Kurzweil system, a system that I've used and was familiar with. And so I just brought it up to my manager, and it was no problem. And it really kind of was viewed as not a problem at all. There was a challenge that came up, and it was probably at the most inopportune time. This was years into my tenure with the company, and we happened to be working with a third party who was examining the company-wide. There was a reorg that was going on, and so there was a company-wide evaluation of positions and roles, and what roles might be able to be absorbed into others. And so we knew we were, all of us, under a microscope, so to speak, but we were just doing our job. I got a notice from IT that my system was, wasn't passing the firewall anymore, wasn't able to be to
Right.
run in the network. And so I had to brought that up, had that discussion, and basically at that point, I was told that I needed to go and get my diagnosis for dyslexia recertified. It had been a couple of years gone by, or many years gone by since I had it. I was diagnosed last. The challenge was, though, in that period, and I looked into getting that being diagnosed again. I couldn't get anything scheduled for months, and the cost was also on.
The burden was on you, right? The
was on
employer's
me.
not going to pay. And so,
Right.
employers do have the right to request medical documentation of the disability before they provide the reasonable accommodation. But I'm going to let you finish.
No, and all of that's, yeah. And it was more of the, there are other alternatives, those that I wasn't able to use. And
Right.
so that's the question. To talk with others that are kind of had the same viewpoint, where you disclose after, they had disclosed after. But some of them had gone through the ADA, or had updated, I should say, a diagnosis. And were told by the employer that the employer loved them. They were working with them, but they were a small organization, and they couldn't afford to purchase these systems, and they were kind of putting it. I mean, even though they were legally bound, and there's
Right.
Tax deductions, and there's things that small employers can
Take advantage of.
take advantage
Certainly.
of. So in those cases, I mean, you always hear, know your rights, and is this something? Well, it gets into the gray areas real quick, and it gets into the weeds very quick, and that's where we need somebody like you. And I'm wondering, in these situations, if you can walk us through for somebody that's maybe not on Social Security, what's the approach we could do?
Sure.
So yeah.
And I think what you started off, what you'd mentioned earlier is the relationship between the employee and the manager and the employee and HR is that, for your set of circumstances, you worked there for a number of years, you'd been productive, there hadn't been an issue up until the time that there's a restructure or reorganization. And it just takes a little bit of humanity, for the lack of a better term, is just to meet somebody where they are, that okay, well, this certain speech to text software doesn't work, but there's these other, different programs that will work, that there's no real reason that employer needed a medical diagnosis from you for the speech to text software, that you've had a track record of using this, you've already previously disclosed. It's, a lot of disabilities aren't something that is likely that you're going to grow out of. You're going to have a disability for, your entire life experience. So it has to be humanity in meeting people where they are, is that none of that needed to happen. Was the employer within their rights to request, medical documentation? Sure. But, for what purpose did they need that you've already had this track record? And so, they hadn't violated the law, it didn't end well for you.
I think that's important, where
Right.
like I knew that legally they were probably in their rights.
Right.
But there was so your work, I mean, when you do work with folks, I mean, you go in a lot of times to mediate. I mean, you come in, right, as to help kind of clear the air a little bit, settle the situation.
That's the goal, because realistically, like, it's a lot. It usually works out for everyone, better if we can just come to agreement to say, if Noah was a client of mine, hey, I've had speech to text software for the past 5 years. They're asking for medical documentation. It's going to take 3 years to get into, see a physician to get this diagnosis. Is $700 out of pocket for me. Like, there's all these different things. And trying to figure out what the employer what is the employer's actual reason for this? Like, do they just need to check a box? Is this something, do they have some prescribed reasonable accommodation process? Is there a way that we can work through this, that we can, look and say, hey, this person's had, a reasonable accommodation for the past 5 years. They've been, a stellar employee for the past 5 years. Can we just, can we work through this? Can we skip all this and just look and see what the reasonable accommodation is? What change can we, there's these other 2 programs out here. Can we test those to make sure that those work? And can we get that instituted instead of, 3 months without this technology, without this reasonable accommodation? You shouldn't be judged on that, your work capability, because it's not showing you realistically what you're capable of, because you don't have the program that's going to, ensure that you can do the job.
When issues over inclusion and disability-specific concerns come up, regardless of whether it's just information gathering or an issue that is more serious, we're going to walk through who you can contact at every stage of this process, so that you're not alone. And these are practical, no-cost approach that everybody should do.
There's different incentives. I mean, your manager has an incentive to get your team to perform at a certain level.
Right.
They have quote. Everything goes up the chain. Well, when these issues come up, and I think we talked about this too, you automatically feel as somebody with, you're talking about a disability or an issue of inclusion, it's you against the company, and the company is, they want to make sure they understand all the ins and outs legally, and then they'll kind of come to you and have that discussion. But even then, you kind of feel the whole weight of the company if it doesn't, align with their overall goal, what their needs are and stuff. So this is where I think it's so important we know kind of where the avenues are, and is it okay? I mean, would it be the right approach for somebody like in this situation, like I had to come to you?
Right. So if you're in a situation where you have a reasonable accommodation, you've had it for years, and for whatever reason the company's reevaluating you, then definitely feel free to contact Disability Rights Maryland. as I previously mentioned, our funding is to work with individuals who are receiving Social Security on the basis of disability. But there are a number of other resources out there. I think the two at this stage in the process, your employer has contacted you and said, hey, we're going to this reevaluation and we need to look at different accommodations for you. The two resources that I would suggest that an employee turn to is the Job Accommodations Network, JAN, or the ADA Center. There's a number of ADA centers throughout the country. Noah and I are based in Maryland, so it's the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. And you give them a call and they have, just really fantastic case managers there who are able to provide you with some technical assistance. And they can also provide technical assistance to the employer. So if all three parties want to get on the phone at the same time and say, hey, look, this is the right of the employee, this is the right of the employer, can we come to some kind of resolution? And then you're doing it in a non-adversarial way, because as soon as you contact an attorney, kind of the hairs on the back of their neck go up, they're raising their haunches, they're kind of bearing down, preparing for a fight. And that's not what it should be or needs to be. It should be a collaborative process, and that's what the law, at least in Maryland, says, is you got to engage in that interactive process.
And I think that's so important too, timing, to have that quick, because the other thing you're again, when I was in this situation, I'm thinking, kind of going through, as I said, that it's the shame, the timing, and the cost. I'm running through all this and trying to determine if it meets the level of where I want to risk possibly losing funding, losing my wage income, right. Or the timing of everything too. Is it something where I really, can I figure out and can I scramble to find something that will work, kind of patch something together, at least during that period of where I'm under the microscope of this contractor and kind of go from there. But I think, and then the third part is the shame. And I talk about this, whether you're a team player, whether you feel like the pressure of, am I really making it, a lot of noise over nothing? And you're constantly, I think, internalizing, I can accept this, I can keep going, but that builds up. And eventually and you don't realize it all the time, but you're putting yourself in a corner. And I think having a good discussion, like a thoughtful discussion with your manager, and if you come to these stumbling blocks, to really, I think what you mentioned, reach out to, so it's the JAN Center, the
Job Accommodations Network,
Job Accommodations, and the ADA centers.
Yeah.
To get on a call and to get some of those facts,
right,
for both sides, I think is really good. I think that's so important.
Ben provides real-life examples of implicit bias and imposter syndrome.
We had touched briefly on two other situations, and one you had mentioned, which was some of your clients that are receiving Social Security and come to you. You had mentioned a situation where this one lady was taking her lunch breaks, and
right.
That wasn't the norm kind of in her office at the time. And
right. And so it's happened to numerous clients, men and women with different conditions. And so it gets into what I think you're touching on, Noah, is like those implicit bias and imposter syndrome, is that you work for a company and say that you need dialysis, so you take your hour lunch break, but the office culture is that you don't take an office lunch break, and you get a new manager, you get a new company, and you're entitled to, everybody's entitled to that hour lunch break, or you're taking a break to go through chemo or whatever different treatment that you're undergoing for this break. And you have this, your old manager was fine with it, your old staff, you're still producing at the same rate, but because the office culture is such that everybody works through their lunch, then you're starting to stick out. And it really it's difficult because that new company, if you're going through restructuring, or a new manager, if they start to question that, the workplace is not going to feel as welcoming or as comfortable. And it does start to feel like a hostile environment. Is just like, you're taking your hour lunch break. It's not something that you have to disclose. There's no reason that you have to disclose that.
But you start feeling the pressure. Come on. Yeah,
Right. You start
exactly.
feeling that pressure, and you start feeling that you're uncomfortable in that workplace. And so I think, um, if you can resolve it, if you the tough part is the issue is not on the employer. It's not, or sorry, on the employee. It's not the employee's, fault. It's the fault of, the manager. There's no reason to question somebody about them taking an hour lunch break. They're entitled to that hour lunch break. What they do on that lunch break, as long as it doesn't, impact their work, has nothing to do with them. And so it's just finding that balance. And it's tough because these questions do add up, and then you start to feel like, ooh, maybe I don't belong, or is there a way that I can work my disability into this? Like, and it's really tough that
You'll start
there's
hearing words of like culture, come into
right,
play. Well, you might not be a fit for this culture, and all these things. And it's, I think it's so important that you, um, it's not about taking drastic steps. I don't think about like,
no,
but I think what you mentioned, there are routes, there are groups out there that you can get quick information. You can jump and bring others on, others from your
right,
employer, your manager specifically, on board to at least walk things out, clear things enough so that maybe you don't have to fully disclose what you're doing, but it's also important enough for them to kind of set the, a more level playing field.
certainly. And then if it does arise to that point where, you know, you're not a part of the culture, or you're late getting back from whatever treatment that you're undergoing, and you're late 3 times, and now we're looking at you to see if the employer's looking at you. He's like, oh, there's some kind of remediation that we can undergo, and we're looking to fire you. That's at the point where you're going to engage with other organizations like the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, or the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, that will investigate and see if you were discriminated on the basis of your disability.
And the great thing I would assume is because you've already reached out kind of through these channels, so they have some of this documented as well, kind of what that process was, that you've been trying to work through this
Right.
in a way, and you kind of are, if it does boil up or whatever, that there's now, kind of a case on your side being formed too. So again, it's not you against this company,
Right.
and to start at that point is very difficult. You're trying to catch everyone up to speed, what's going on, and
Exactly.
and so.
And so, yeah, if the entire time you're engaging with your employer, and they're open, and you're having these discussions, and you're alerting to them, like, these are the reasonable accommodations I need, and you're engaging with these outside organizations that are just resources. And I think that kind of, make sure that everybody is on level playing field, that everybody knows what the rights are, knows what the processes are. And, if it is speech to text, or if it's another technology, then the ADA Resource Center or Jan might know of like an equipment loaning program that a certain state or region is involved with, that, if it's a smaller employer that's still covered by the ADA, but they have these thin margins, well, they can go to the state and say, hey, look, well, you can't afford to buy it, but, Maryland's running this pilot program, so you can rent this certain software, or, this physical piece of technology, or whatever it is.
Yeah, and that's so important, because you do hear this mantra of know your rights. Well, there's just so much there. You can
Right.
understand the 4 corners basically of generally what the ADA, and your rights are, but to really get into the weeds, and believe me, it's more, I think it's so important, yeah, that others, kind of get involved. And it's also a good way, it can add to, more healthy environment with you and your employer too. It's not always, like you said, it's not adversarial. It's not, you're not trying to, dig in your heels so much as like, everybody just kind of coming to a level of agreement and stuff, and understanding moving forward. So yeah, I think that's so important.
Ben provides evidence that stigmas and bias around disability hiring still very much exist. But we go even further and we look at the value of a higher educational degree for that of a mainstream student compared to a student with a disability, and the value relative to getting a job. and how the disparities are so enormous.
You worked with a number of that are, have advanced degrees,
Yeah.
and yet they come out with these degrees. They can obviously, they have the ability, but are either stuck getting I mean,
Right. Exactly. So
not
they're,
no jobs or
unemployed or
unemployed.
underemployed.
Yeah, it's amazing. Can you
Yeah.
talk to us a little bit about it?
Yeah, certainly. So there's a number of um, clients that I had who've had master's degrees or higher, and they want to, obviously put those, degrees that they've had accumulated debt and
Right.
worked through. And so it's really trying to get past, stigmas, bias, and really, ensure that, that these employers, prospective employers, are able to see that they've credentialized themselves to the point of anyone else that they should be employed doing what they want to do. And so it's difficult because sometimes there's other we don't I don't assist really with people finding jobs. I'm not a job
Right.
coach or anything like that, but a lot of job coaches will just be like, oh, this is a person with a physical disability or whatever their disability is, processing, intellectual disability. And they'll just look at this is a person with a disability and say, okay, well, I've had a success with putting, having a person with a disability in, this one field. All people with disabilities, I'm automatically going to funnel them there. And that's not the case. And
Right.
so it's really looking at people on that individualized basis, like you had mentioned initially, is that this person, has learned throughout their entire life through the academic process. Maybe they've done other employment experiences, what works for them. And so one of the bigger reasonable accommodations pre this novel coronavirus
Mhm.
was working from home. So, whether or not you have difficulty getting transportation, or if you have an autoimmune disorder, and so you were already at risk of contracting another disability that could, really impact your daily basis. But a number of disabled um, clients came to me and they would ask their employer, can I work from home? And pre-coronavirus, like, oh no, well, we don't have the technology, we don't have the capability, you can't do that. The pandemic hits, everybody has to work from home, and
Right.
now all of a sudden they can do,
Right. Right.
everybody's able to,
It's amazing how that happens, right? It's
it,
just
it's amazing. It is so tragic. So,
yeah.
it's funny because um, just a month or so before the coronavirus hit, I was in Annapolis testifying on behalf of a bill that would include virtual resumes and other just different options for prospective job seekers with disabilities. And the pushback that we received was huge of like, oh no, like how are, if the physical location of this job site for whatever reason was not accessible, can we do remote work or a remote interview and all of these things now that over the past 8 months have become secondhand, or might have taken 5 6 months 7 months during this pandemic. But realistically, people, if people have listened to people with disabilities and instituted these reasonable accommodations, we would have been in a lot better position during the pandemic, because these directly impacted populations have these solutions, because you've learned throughout your entire education
Right.
process what works and what doesn't work, and what creative solutions can
Yeah.
help people be more productive.
Yeah. Yeah. That's. I think it is so important. Not just for dyslexics. I mean, I've connected with others in the larger disabled community, and it's just so important because we really are the canaries in the coal mines, and we've kind of been through a lot of this before.
Right.
And it's now. I think there is a little bit more focus, or a lot more focus, but you really do have to kind of listen to us, I think, or listen to
Yes.
voices in these communities, because it really does matter, and it really would help companies, in a larger degree.
Oh, certainly.
Listen, I know we are pushing up against a time crunch here. There's so many more things I'd love to touch on. Maybe at a different time we can do that, because I think this is such a critical discussion. I think it kind of, you know, hits at the core of a lot of what I'm working on, what I want to do, which is, you know, around these areas of gray, you know, kind of this gray area of discrimination and inclusion, or, well, I should say inclusion. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, even with this messaging that's going out, even with this enormous, the funds that are going into this. There's areas where gaps in the system need to be sealed up. And I think, you know, kind of discussions like this really help with that and kind of getting the word out. So listen, it was so great of you to take some time today to talk with us, Ben. I really do.
Thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate that. And definitely looking forward to future conversations. And, you know, if anybody watching this needs more information, do feel free to get in contact with me. My email address is benj@disabilityrightsmd.org. And definitely, if you feel that you've been discriminated against and you've lost or in your verge of losing your job and you live in Maryland, I would recommend that you contact the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights or the Equal Opportunities Employment Commission. And if you're just in the process of, you know, looking for a job or want to know more about what your reasonable accommodation rights are, I would encourage you to look at the Job Accommodations Network or the Mid-Atlantic ADA Centers. Check out those resources.
Yeah, if it's all right with you, Ben, I'm going to add some of your contacts, and also I'll list those links as well under this presentation. But again, this was really great. I do appreciate it, and
great talking to you. Talk to you soon.
Yeah,